Welcome back to How to Play 40K. This is episode 9, where it's going to be a brief rundown of how you set up your first game. And then in episode 10, we're actually going to be playing our demo game. So when you're preparing for your game, you need to do a couple of things. With your opponent, if this is just a casual game, of course. If it's a tournament, all these things will be determined. But we're talking casual gaming now. First thing you need to do is pick the army that you want to play on both sides, you and your opponent, and decide what point level you're going to play. So the commonest point levels in North America right now is 1850 points. That's different in Europe. But 1850 in North America is probably the commonest point value for a full game of Warhammer 40K. So as long as you agree on the same number of points, then you should be starting off with roughly equal strength of armies. Next, you need to pick the mission that you're going to play. So every game, there's a mission, and the mission tells you what you have to do in order to win the game. It's not always about killing all the models of your opponent's army, although if you do manage to do that, you automatically win. So that's called tabling your opponent, is when you've destroyed all the models that they have. But assuming you don't table your opponent, you need to complete the mission. And in some cases where it would be otherwise impossible for you to win the game by tabling the opponent because of the matchups, sometimes you can still win the game if you stick to the mission. So if you're sticking to what they call main rulebook missions, there's really two kinds of missions, and there's 12 missions in total. So these are called Eternal War missions, and these are called Maelstrom of War missions. And the rulebook actually tells you all about these. And it tells you what the primary objectives of the mission are, what the secondary objectives of the mission are, and then it tells you how to deploy and all those things. So if you just have a look at the rulebook here, so you'll see here Eternal War, the Scouring. It tells you how to set up the battlefield, the deployment zones, where to put the objective markers, how to deploy, what the game length is, and then the primary and secondary objectives, and any special rules. So these are called Eternal War missions, and then Maelstrom missions are here. If you just start off by playing rulebook missions, you won't go wrong, and it'll tell you how to play the game. And there's 3 deployment types in Warhammer 40K. One is called Dawn of War, where you're deploying along the long edges of the table. One is called Hammer and Anvil, where you're deploying along the short edges. And one is called Vanguard Strike, where you split it into diagonals. Okay, and we'll come to that in a second. So when you play your mission, there's usually primary and secondary objectives, and when you score these primary or secondary objectives, you get what's called victory points. And so generally the person at the end of the game with the most victory points is the winner. The primary and secondary objectives obviously differ per mission, but generally they involve either capturing specific points on the map that are called objectives, or killing a specific model or an enemy unit, or just having forces in a certain location. So we're just going to talk about capturing objectives for a second, and then we'll talk about secondary objectives. All right, here we have an objective. And what is an objective? It is literally just a point on the map that is being deemed significant in some way just for the purposes of the game. It's not necessarily a terrain feature or anything, although it could be, and usually either the rulebook tells you where to put the objectives or the opponents put them at the beginning of the game. So if it was your turn to put an objective, you can put it anywhere you want. Anyway, we're going to put it here. So in order to capture an objective, you need to have a model within 3 inches of it, okay? So this bike is within 3 inches of the objective, therefore he is holding or captured this objective, okay? And you know, his unit would be there. If he was more than 3 inches away, he would not be counted as holding the objective, and if he had a primary objective that was to capture this objective number 3, he would not fulfill that criteria. Now in this situation where they are within 3 inches of this objective, but there's an enemy model within 3 inches of this objective, they are now contesting this objective, okay? He's contesting the objective, and these guys are contesting the objective because they're both within 3 inches of it, okay? Now there's a special rule called objective secured, and if you have this special rule, that means unless the opponent also has objective secured, you will control the objective even if they have models within 3 inches because you have sort of special objective securing powers, okay? So if these guys had objective secured and this demon did not have objective secured, then although they're all within 3 inches, this objective would belong to these guys, okay? So that's how objectives and objective secured works. So in main rulebook missions, there are also a number of secondary objectives. You can see examples here. So slay the warlord means if you kill the enemy's warlord model, you get an extra victory point. First blood, it goes to the person who destroys the first unit in the game. So only one player can get that. And line breaker is at the end of the game, if you have at least one model that's within 12 inches of your enemy's table edge, you score a victory point. So these are examples of secondary objectives. Before you start your game, you also have to determine who your warlord is, and as we've already discussed in previous episodes, that's a character model, or if you have no characters, any model that's going to be your warlord. And if your warlord is a character, then they get a warlord trait, and you can roll on any of these random tables. Often codexes will have their own warlord traits, and some characters will in fact have already a assigned warlord trait that you can't roll. So at the beginning of your game, if you need to roll a warlord trait, then you roll that up and tell your opponent, okay? The other thing that you need to do at the beginning of the game before you start is to figure out what your psychic powers are. And so what you need to do then is figure out what school or discipline of psychic powers your various psychers are going to roll on, and then roll your d6 to figure out what psychic powers you have, as we discussed in the psychic phase episode. And the final thing to talk about before we show you how to set up is game length. So most Warhammer missions in the main rulebook have what they call variable game length. So you go for 5 turns, and then at the end of turn 5 you roll a d6. And on a 3+, the game continues, otherwise the game is over. And then at the end of turn 6, you roll another d6, and on a roll of 4+, the game continues, and then after turn 7, automatically ends. So the most turns you could play is 7, and the least turns you could play is 5. That just adds a little bit of strategy and variability to each game. Okay, so we've got our table here. And when you're starting a game, after you've decided what mission you're playing, and you've decided what armies you're playing and the point values and all those sorts of things, then what you have to do is place your objective markers, and depending on the mission that you've picked, it will tell you how to do that. And then after that, what you need to do is decide with your opponent what the terrain means in terms of what cover saves it's going to give you. So you can adjust where you put the terrain based on how you guys feel about the table. So in tournaments, generally the terrain is already set up, but if you're just playing a casual game with your friends, you can decide, oh, I don't like where this goes and it has to go somewhere else. And then you decide what this terrain means. So you can say anybody who's in this rune has a 4+ cover save, and you can just agree beforehand what cover saves that all the terrain gives, and whether terrain counts as difficult or dangerous or impassable terrain. So that's important to set out right at the beginning. Then what you have to do is roll for deployment type if it's not specified in the mission. So if it specifies in the mission how you're supposed to deploy your armies, then you do it that way. If it doesn't, you can roll for the deployment type. So remember, you can have Vanguard Strike, which is the diagonals. You can have Hammer and Anvil, which is short edges, or you can have Dawn of War, which is along the long edge. Okay. After you decided, or the mission tells you what deployment type is, then you have to roll for sides. So let's say we're doing Hammer and Anvil. So this is one deployment side, and over there is the other deployment zone. So then you just roll off with your opponent, d6, and whoever scores highest gets to pick their side that they want to deploy on, okay? Then the next thing you got to do is roll for who gets to deploy first and thus go first. And then keeping in mind that the person who doesn't go first later will have a chance to what they call seize the initiative, or have a chance to roll a dice to see if they can actually end up going first. So whoever wins the roll gets to choose whether they want to go second or first. And if you choose to go first, then you will deploy your army within your deployment zone first, and then the other player will deploy their army in response to your deployment. Okay, so that's deployment and choosing first turn. Then what you need to do is roll for night fighting, and what night fighting does is the first turn of the game, there's +1 to, there's a 6+ cover save in the open, or +1 to cover save. So that's just in the first turn to represent that the first part of the battle is at night. Okay, so you can roll for that if you want that to be part of your game. Then you deploy your armies. Okay, and when we play our demo game, you're going to see how we deploy our armies. But you deploy your armies, then whoever goes second deploys their armies. Then if you need to decide things like reserves and infiltrating. So what is reserves? So any model can be kept in reserve, i.e. that means you don't deploy it on the battle, and you leave it off to the side to come in at a later turn in the game. Reserves, under normal circumstances, can only start arriving in turn 2 or beyond, okay? And you roll individually for each unit to come on from reserve. If you roll 3+, they get to come on from reserve, and if they roll less than 3, then they're stuck till the next turn. And you do that in turn 2 and turn 3, and then if any reserves that haven't arrived yet automatically come in on turn 4, okay? So that's how you roll for reserves. And when you come in for reserves, there's lots of different ways of coming in for reserve, which we'll not cover, but that's basically reserves. The other thing you have to decide, if anybody in your army has the infiltrate rule, then they can actually infiltrate after everything is deployed. So basically, each side sets up their army, and then they roll off to see if they have infiltrators that need to deploy, who gets to deploy their infiltrators first. And infiltrators can go basically anywhere on the field with certain restrictions. So then you deploy your infiltrators, okay? And then after you've done your deployment, you've determined your reserves, and you've deployed your infiltrators, then it comes time for seize the initiative. So seize the initiative is opportunity for whoever goes second to actually end up going first. So you can choose not to seize the initiative, but if you want to end up going first, then you have to roll d6, and if you hit a 6, you've seized the initiative and you actually get to go first. That's obviously a big advantage because you got to deploy second, countering your opponent's deployment, but realizing that most likely you'd be going second, but now you get to go first, and so that's a big tactical advantage. So that's seize the initiative. And then after seize the initiative, you do what we call scout moves. So if your army has the special rule scout, certain models or units may be able to move in addition to their deployment before the game actually starts. So that's scout, and then the game will start. So that's a quick overview of the various things you have to do before you actually start to play the game. Just to summarize, you got to determine your armies and point values. You got to determine what mission you're playing, place your objectives. You have to determine the terrain with your opponent. You have to decide how you're going to deploy. You have to decide who gets which side to deploy on. You have to decide who gets to go first and deploy first, who gets to go second and deploy second. You have to then deploy your army. Then you have to figure out who's infiltrating and who gets to infiltrate first and second. Then you try and seize the initiative if appropriate, and then you actually go on and do scout moves, and then the game starts.